Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. My name is Adrian and today we're going to be doing a top 5 list. This is going to be a top 5 of my favourite fantasy worlds. Now this is sort of a broad category, so this is going to be taking into account lots of things, so whether that's the field, the geography, the cultures, the variety of what's going on in a world, to some extent even things like the magic system, the people in that world. Like, it's going to be a very broad category in terms of, think about world building, so that's going to come down to all sorts of things, even down to societies and organizations, as well as the big macro things like geography, geology, all that kind of stuff. So yeah, there's going to be a really broad range of reasons that I might have chosen a particular world or setting as one of my favourites on this list. Let's jump straight into it then. So my number 5 favourite fantasy world of all time, and this comes from the Great Coat series, and this is Tristia. Now I know Tristia is the name of one of the countries rather than the whole world or continent, but yeah, Tristia. I absolutely love it. I think that Sebastian de Castell has done an incredibly good job at building a world here that is very interesting. It seems to be relatively low magic, especially as we first get introduced to it. And it's not so much the world in terms of sort of nature or the geology or the geography. There's not that much going on that would be different to your standard fantasy world here. But what I love is the societies that Sebastian de Castell has built here. I love the way that he deals with the governance. He deals with this sort of feudal system that is in place, how we have a kingdom, but then we also have multiple dukedoms under that. And I really like the political and even social and economic landscape that we get placed into in Tristia. There is somewhat of a power vacuum at different points during the series, and I think that leads to very interesting outcomes. And we are at the point where we are on a knife edge often. The world, the country is on a knife edge often. It could go one way or the other, and it's at such a point where 1 or 2 or 3 people doing the right thing in the right place can have huge ramifications and huge impacts on the world. Not a massively heavy magic presence in Tristia, and like I said, it's a relatively normal in a geological sense, but I really like the political and the social interactions we get in Tristia and the way that that's been set up, especially the history as well. I think there's a lot of history as we get further through the series, where we dig into historical organizations and different societies that have been around and where they have been and where they are currently. It feels quite deep in terms of the very personal anthropological side of things, and that I do really love. Let's move on to number 4, and this is the Banished Lands. So this is from The Faithful and the Fallen and Of Blood and Bone by John Gwynne. I really like the Banished Lands. Now, for lots of people, the Banished Lands might be quite a tropey world. There's not a huge set of new stuff going on here, but I really like the way it's explored and introduced. I really like the way that John Gwynne takes inspiration from a lot of Celtic myth and folklore. I love that we have a slightly more Roman tinge and slant to things as we go into different areas of the world. I like that there are differences, and I like the magic that we get and how simple it is. There's not a million things going on. The fantasy conceits we have are relatively simple, so it's humans in a world where there are also giants, and I think that is done nicely. Like, there's not a million things going on. We have one other real obvious sentient culture we're dealing with, and I like the exploration of the giants and how they fit into things. I like that they are used in a similar, it sounds weird to say, but it's sort of a similar role to how elves are often used in fantasy. They are the elder race in some ways. They have been there longer, they have a longer history, they know more about the magical elements in the world than the humans seem to, and I really like that slight twist on that kind of trope of almost the elder race. I think that's done very well. I really like that we get different sets of magic popping up, but they are relatively unknown to people at large. I love the creatures we get, whether they be the wolfen or whether they be the snakes or yeah, all kinds of things that I don't want to talk too much about in case that's a spoiler. But yeah, incredibly good. I even love that the fact that the Banished Lands themselves are not humanity's continent, really. They have come from elsewhere. They are almost the invader. But we don't explore that massively, but I really like that conceit as well. I think that's done nicely. And it's almost like the giants are retreating away from them. I just like those interactions that we have between different societies of humans, how they interact and how they relate, but they're not the same. And I really like the way that we see the relationship with the giants as well. And in Of Blood and Bone, the sequel trilogy, I think we get a much bigger expansion on this. Some of the things that get explored a little bit in The Faithful and the Fallen are explored much more deeply. There's a lot more magical, divine elements that come into play. And I think that are explored really well. And I think there's some reality in the exploration of that. Those of you who've read it will know what I mean by that, that it's not all clear cut. It's not clean lines between different creatures and species, and I think that's very interesting and explored relatively well. And yeah, the Banished Lands, definitely a world I really, really love. Now, in at number 3, I really couldn't decide how to split this or not split this entry. So I'm just going to go as a whole, The Cosmere by Brandon Sanderson. I really love the Cosmere. Now, there are particular worlds in the Cosmere that I have a massive affinity to. I love Scadrial. I love, that's the world that Mistborn is set on. And I really love the aesthetic, the grey bleakness of Scadrial. And I think it's a very interesting setting with the way the politics are set up, having this overarching divine Lord Ruler. And then we have these much weaker noble houses who are vying for favour, but they don't really have any power in and of themselves. Their power is inherently drawn from the overarching dictator, and I find that quite an interesting setup. And then we compare that to Roshar, which is the world that the Stormlight Archive is set on, which is very different in the fact that there are many, many warring nations, or different nations may or may not be warring. We are very much following the Alethi initially, but then there are lots of other countries that have very, very different cultures. And I think Roshar and Stormlight Archive does a much better job in terms of exploring cultural differences, religious differences, than we get in Mistborn. One of my things I would say with Roshar is that it does feel, historically, it feels quite sparse. Like there seems to be quite big gaps where in the history either nothing of note happened or nobody knows of anything of note that's happened in these massive gaps, which is interesting, which does make it feel a little bit sparser. Yeah, it doesn't feel quite as full and like as vivid as our real world does. It doesn't feel quite that way in Mistborn, and when it does, it kind of makes sense because of the way the society has been built from the ground up. It always seems to, I always feel like I can give it a little bit more leeway for that sparseness in its history. I will also say that I love the way that all these worlds in the Cosmere interrelate. I love how Sel, where Elantris is set, clearly has big things that are going to be massive for the Cosmere, but we just don't really see where they're going to fit in yet. Really interesting, and I think there are going to be massive crossovers coming, and I think that you don't want to be sleeping on how big a deal Sel is and how big a deal Selish magic is. So the magic from Elantris is in the Cosmere as those things start to come together. So I'm really, really excited for where the Cosmere is going. This could easily jump massively up my list as we start to see more and more of these interconnections and how all these planets and worlds work together. So I really, really love the Cosmere. In at number 2 is the world from what I have got down as my favourite standalone fantasy book of all time, and that is the world from the Lord of the Rings, so Middle Earth. I love Middle Earth, I always have, whether that was from when I was reading The Hobbit as a kid, whether that was my first read through of The Lord of the Rings, or even just a couple of years ago, the first time I ever actually got all the way through the Silmarillion. And I will say my love for Middle Earth has grown immensely since starting reading the Silmarillion and finishing it. I loved it anyway. I loved the way that Tolkien used cultural artifacts in The Lord of the Rings. He would refer to things that we didn't know what they were and they never got explained because it didn't make sense for them to be explained to the characters at the time, and I really liked that. But then I love how we can then dig into that in the Silmarillion. I can see those references to Beren and Luthien. I can see those references to Hurin and Turin. I think it's just done really, really well. Tolkien is the quintessential world builder, whether that be with his races or his languages, his creation story, the myths of from the first age that flow all the way through the second and into the third, where we see it in The Lord of the Rings. And I just think it's done so incredibly well. Middle-earth is just a very vivid and real place for me. And that is only been increased reading wider in Tolkien's Legendarium, reading these three over here, so the Children of Húrin, Beren and Luthien, and the Fall of Gondolin, reading the Silmarillion for the first time. That has really expanded this world in a way that I just absolutely adore. If you are a big Lord of the Rings fan and you've never tried to read the Silmarillion, I really highly recommend it. If you've tried it and it's not for you, fine. Like, I understand that it is not for everybody. But if you haven't ever tried it, I really recommend giving it a good go. Just done so well. I really enjoyed reading the Silmarillion as I was listening to the Prancing Pony podcast. I'll put a link down below for those of you who don't know what that is. So yeah, it's exploring Tolkien's books, and then it will have a podcast on each chapter, or sometimes if they're big chapters with lots happening, they'll have multiple podcasts on a chapter. And that was wonderful for me as I was reading through the Silmarillion to get a better, more in-depth take on what was going on, and it really solidified some of the ideas of what Tolkien was working on in my mind as I was reading it. There, through the Silmarillion, through The Hobbit, a large way through The Lord of the Rings now. So if you've never checked that out and you're a Tolkien fan, go give it a listen. Sean and Alan over there are great. And then into number one. Now, for lots of you who've watched my channel a bit, this will not be a massive surprise. This is a world that I just feel so invested in. I feel like it is a world that I know and I love. And it's very interesting that I'm making this video the day after a big drop happened for this series on the internet. You should go check that out. And this is the world of the Wheel of Time. I'm not going to call it the name that lots of people call it, because I don't want to give anything away if you've never read the series. The world of the Wheel of Time is just wonderful. It is incredible. Now, the reasons for this are many. I love the idea of the Wheel of Time spinning, and how we have these ages that just come and go and we just cycle around. It's just another turning of the wheel. Everything has happened before and it will happen again. And I really like that sort of philosophical concept for a fantasy world. As well as that, I really enjoy the sneak peek into the history we get. And now Robert Jordan does an interesting thing of giving us some characters who are there, who know more about the history than the characters should that we are following at that time. And I think that's really good and really interesting. Gives us these sneak peeks. I think we get these visions of a world from the past, and that is done so well as flashbacks. So often flashbacks get derided in fantasy and in fiction in general, people hating them. I think the flashbacks we get, particularly in the Shadow Rising Book 4, add such a massive depth of world building that it's the reason that the Shadow Rising is one of my favourite Wheel of Time books. I just love the exploration of that we get through those visions, through those flashbacks. As well as that, it's so much about the different cultures. It's the different nations, and how it's not the Wheel of Time. The world is not separated by race; it is separated by nationality, and I think that's really interesting. It doesn't matter what race you are, what colour your skin is, what your ethnic background is. It's all about what nation are you from, and I think that's an interesting take on world building. And the nation you're from is not necessarily intrinsically linked to your ethnic roots, to your genealogy, to your genetics. It's about where you are, and I think that's really interesting. And each nation has a very specific culture. There are lots of clear and obvious little things that Jordan gives us to differentiate between these cultures, and then there's a lot more subtle things going on as well with behaviour, what is acceptable, what is socially acceptable, which gets explored a lot throughout the slog in an arc that I know a lot of people don't like. But the world is just done so well, and to me, it feels really lived in, and I feel like I could be there. I don't know if that's Jordan's descriptions as well as the world he's built, but it just feels so vivid and real, and it is a world that I will continue to love for a very, very long time. The magic system we get in the world is incredible as well, and all the magic systems we get in the world are incredible as well. I really, really love them. And then we even have wonderful creatures, whether we're talking about the Ogier, who are just amazing, or whether it's some of their sort of darker creatures that we get, whether that be the Myrddraal or the Trollocs, are just very interesting takes on relatively classic fantasy creatures and tropes. And I just think it's done so well. Yeah, I could gush about the Wheel of Time all day, but I better not. So there we go, my 5 favourite fantasy worlds of all time. Definitely massively heavily weighted towards those top 3. Those top 3 are worlds that I just take me home. Like, it's escapism, but in a very comforting way. It doesn't feel like getting away. It feels like, it's like a staycation. It's getting away to another home. Yeah, that's what it feels like reading those series. And I just love them so much. And it's one of the many reasons that I love fantasy, is that we get to explore these wonderful and incredible new worlds. If you've enjoyed this video, click the like button, subscribe if you want to see more of my content, and hopefully I will see you guys again soon.